Greetings, people who really like grammar. I made quite a few videos on the noun complement, and I tried to show how it's kind of related to the noun clause. And I watched a few of my noun complement videos a few days ago, and I thought that there might be a possibility that some people might still get confused. So I'd like to do a quick review here. So originally, I did an extensive study on the word that. And if you watched any of those videos, you would have seen that I refer to the word that as a distinction indicator, and it can be a noun clause indicator. In other words, I determined that the word that can have 5 grammatical functions, where most people don't think there are that many, but I think there's 5 grammatical functions for the word that. And one of them is noun clause indicator and distinction clause or distinction phrase indicator, okay? So we'll take a look at that because that's where the confusion might happen. Now, to me, the area that might cause the most confusion is the use of the word that, all right, as a distinction clause indicator, or the use of the word that as a noun clause indicator. Of course, it's the same word, but it's used for 2 different functions here. So let's take a close look at this. Now, a distinction clause in my grammar system, my own personal system, is what you'd probably call a relative clause. That's a really crappy name, and I got rid of it. Relative clause, and generally people refer to this as a relative pronoun, but in this particular case, when you look at sentences like this, it is not a relative pronoun. That's just a crappy name. So I got rid of it. And I called the word that a distinction clause indicator or a distinction phrase indicator. So let's look at a sample sentence here. All right. The proposition that he was advancing was preposterous. Okay. The distinction clause indicator in this case, all right, is indicating that we have a distinction clause. And what does the distinction clause do? It makes a distinction. This clause here is making a distinction about the word proposition. In other words, the proposition that he was advancing was preposterous. Now, the key word, all right, in this distinction clause is advancing. All right? In other words, he was advancing a proposition. He was trying to promote this. He was trying to push it forward and sell it. Okay, see, he was advancing the proposition. He was trying to pitch it, trying to get you to buy it. All right, that's what this distinction clause tells us. Now, here's a noun clause, and it looks the same. It has the same word that, but in this case, it's a noun clause indicator. It's indicating, telling us that this is a noun clause here. All right, and we read this, all right, in context with the rest of the discourse. It might be a few sentences or a full paragraph, but the point is we take this sentence in context and we see that we have the key word proposition, all right? In this sentence, the key word was advancing. In other words, he was promoting, advancing, pushing, selling. But down here, the key word to keep in mind is the proposition itself. Okay, now, what's the proposition? Well, the noun clause in this case, all right, is acting as a noun complement. So what that clause is doing is it's complementing or completing the word proposition. So when you read this, you see the proposition that he was advancing was preposterous. Oh, you see here, this is different now. That he was advancing means he was being promoted or moving up the ladder in his corporation. In other words, he was getting ahead. He was advancing, being promoted. That's different. The meaning is different than it was in this sentence. So you see here, this is the actual noun clause. And here's your noun clause indicator, the word that. And you have the noun clause functioning as a noun complement here. But the context tells us that this is a whole different idea, a whole different thought. If you think about that for a little bit, it'll make sense. Now let's look at a different clause. I've chosen that he loves to serve, okay? That's a clause because it has a subject and a verb, all right? So it qualifies as a clause. Now, let's use that clause in this sentence, and we see that it functions as a distinction clause, okay? The entree that he loves to serve is veal parmigiana, okay? That's the sentence. And we see that the word that is a distinction clause indicator. It's indicating that we have a distinction clause here. And that clause, what it does is makes a distinction about the word entree. So we see that the entree that he loves to serve is veal parmigiana, okay? It's making a distinction. But if you watched my other videos, you will know that this distinction clause is actually functioning as a noun complement, okay? It's a distinction clause, the structure, but it's functioning as a noun complement. You can see that in my previous videos, okay? Now let's look at this same clause. We stuck it in this sentence, all right? But now we have it functioning as a noun clause, all right, or the structure is a noun clause. The characteristic that he loves to serve makes his parents proud. In other words, he's serving in the Marines and it makes his parents proud. The characteristic that he loves to serve makes his parents proud. All right, so you have a noun clause here. Here's your noun clause indicator, the word that. And the noun clause, all right, is also acting as a noun complement. Why? Because it complements or completes the word characteristic. In other words, he loves to serve. That's the trait. That tells you more about the trait, the characteristic in his personality. So here we see clearly that you can have a distinction clause, all right, and it's functioning as a noun complement because that's what it's doing. It's complementing this noun. And you also see that in the noun clause, it's the same wording, all right, the same clause is actually truly a noun clause, but it's still functioning as a noun complement. Now, if you look at that and think about that, you'll see the different meanings of the sentences, the way the clause creates different meaning, but you'll see that they both function as noun complements. I covered that in my previous videos. So we looked at a noun clause used in two different sentences, all right? One was featuring the distinction clause and the other the noun complement, all right? And we tried to clear up any areas that might cause confusion. But what happens when you throw in that same noun clause used as an appositive? You see, it's the very same words, but it's set off, all right, or temporarily isolated with commas, right? It's the same sentence as above, only you see there's the commas there. So what we're saying then is the proposition, comma, that he was advancing, comma, was preposterous. Well, what this appositive's doing is renaming or clarifying the word proposition. In other words, it's telling you more about the proposition to make sure you know what the proposition is, all right? So you have the very same noun clause used in three different ways. But you see here, as an appositive, all it's doing is renaming or clarifying the noun in front of it, okay? So what we have here then is, in the distinction clause, the way it's set up, all right, the way it's structured and the way it reads, you can have more than one proposition. It's possible to have more than one proposition when you say this and you read it and understand it. And also with the clause used as a noun complement, there is the possibility that you can have more than one proposition here when you read this and understand it. But with the appositive, there can be only one proposition, only one. That's what these commas are doing. They're saying this is the proposition. There are no others. The proposition, that he was advancing, in other words, being promoted or getting a raise, was just ridiculous. They said that guy's a crappy guy. Why is he being advanced? Why is he being promoted? It's preposterous. So you see, we're talking about only one proposition, one thing. So there you see the difference between the same clause used as a distinction clause, specifically used as a noun complement, and an appositive. So I hope that helps out, makes it a little bit more clear. And that's about it. So thanks for being incredibly patient, and good night.